Hello again, we're going to get right into it because this video is about very serious stuff. But before I start, full disclosure, I am on the Cook County Appellate Panel for Juvenile Appeals, and I do represent parents who have had their rights terminated or otherwise impeded. That said, we've all heard about Judge Murphy dropping the hammer on DCFS Director Mark Smith, but very few know what led to this ultimate showdown of ultimate destiny. There were 10 contempt findings involving 8 different children, all appealed and consolidated. I'm just going to focus on one of these cases because the remaining 9 are really just kind of Pete and repeat of what happened. So there's a 14-year-old teenager. The parents are unfortunately MIA. The teen is living with grandma, and sadly, grandma has dementia. She can't care for the child. House is uninhabitable. DCFS steps in, and they ultimately recommend psychiatric services because the child, kept running away from the aunts who they placed with them to be at the grandmother's now uninhabited and condemned house. So the child gets psychiatric help, and every 6 months the court conducts what's called a permanency hearing. If you're new to juvenile practice, it's like a status hearing to check on the progress of services. So in October, they do the permanency hearing, and they find there's no reason to continue psychiatric services for the child, so an order is entered to place the kid somewhere else. And for whatever reason, DCFS sits on their hands and does nothing. So they come back to court a month later. Kid is still in psychiatric care, so they transfer it to the BMN calendar, which is a unique court call for cases where, kids have been left at service centers well beyond the prescribed period, and this call is designed to get DCFS's attention. So they come back a month later. We're now in December. The kid is still there. And what's DCFS doing? Well, according to the caseworker, they swear they looked everywhere but couldn't find anywhere to put the teen. So the judge orders the DCFS director, Mark Smith, to make sure the child is placed and gives about 14 or so days. And it appears very little happened because 2 weeks later, the GAL, Charles Goldberg, who you will hear a bit more about in just a few minutes, says DCFS is thumbing their nose at the court, and he files a contempt petition against the DCFS director for failing to place the child. So when they get to the contempt hearing, the kid is suddenly on the wait list for placement. However, Charles correctly notes that a wait list is not the same as placement and pushes forward on the contempt hearing. The excuse Director Smith gives for non-placement is, COVID and staffing issues. During the hearing, it was noted that there were 150 children that were being held beyond their discharge date, and there were at least 50 hospitalized beyond medical necessity. Essentially, DCFS is placing these kids into centers and leaving them there well beyond their discharge date, making them sort of de facto prisoners. Director Smith's excuses weren't good enough as far as the trial court was concerned, and he was held in contempt for ignoring the order, and DCFS appealed, saying, "It's not our fault." Now, joining this appeal was an amicus curiae, which for non-lawyers, that's like a brief that's filed usually by a nonprofit or another organization saying, "Hey, appellate court, this issue impacts us too." And that brief was filed by Heidi Dallenberg of the ACLU, who argued alongside Attorney Goldberg that the methods DCFS used were guaranteed to fail and that there were plenty of alternatives to getting these kids timely placed. DCFS just chose not to use them. But the appellate court vacates the contempt because the issue isn't whether the efforts were realistic, but whether DCFS was ignoring the court's order, and they felt that DCFS wasn't. They were just doing a terrible job at complying. To be fair, the appellate court is not Team DCFS, and they note that, quote, "While the trial court erred in the methods it employed to coerce Director Smith into action in these cases, it is clear that the trial court was attempting to address a serious, widespread problem," end quote. Now, the good news is that Charles and Heidi's efforts to hold DCFS accountable did ultimately get all these kids into proper placements. However, it appears this isn't the only problem with DCFS. Here's a short list. These 2 caseworkers, for example, were charged for ignoring abuse that led to the death of this young child. Here's a media report that notes hundreds of children sleep in DCFS office floors. And a few weeks before that report, another article came out showing DCFS was blocking children who were survivors of abuse from getting lawful visas. And you have this DCFS employee charged with child pornography. And finally, and most troubling, from December of 2021 through July of 22, 8 children died on DCFS's watch.
Tragically, I need to make a correction to this number. It's not 8, it's 171, if you can believe that.
And all this has come down really within the last 3 years. Director Smith, He was interviewed by the Better Government Association regarding some of these problems. Here's his response. I'm just presenting it here without comment. Feel free to pause if you want. If it wasn't for individual lawyers who were willing to stick their neck out like Charles Goldberg or Heidi Dallenberg, or trial judge Patrick Murphy, who was willing to ruffle some political feathers and go to bat for these kids, let's be real, all of this would have been swept under the rug. So for those out there fighting the good fight, thank you. Anyways, next week we return to form with Hyman, a new case about divorce fraud and how one lawyer found a pretty clever workaround to it. It's a good one, so if you want to get notified when it drops, well, you know what to do. Anyways, that's all I have. Thanks for watching.
You're treated like you're an inmate, like all the rest of them, even though you're supposed to be gone.
Janiyah Kane is one of many, according to a new federal lawsuit. It alleges the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services left kids in the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center, even after they were eligible for release.
It feels like nobody cares about me when they was the people who's supposed to get me out of a bad situation.
The lawsuit claims it happened to more than 80 children last year alone, with kids who could have been released upon request spending an average of 40 extra days locked up. And it happened to a child as young as 11.
Being forced to remain incarcerated months after a judge has ordered release to your guardian can exacerbate feelings of abandonment, loss, anxiety, anger, and powerlessness for these children.